Sound is a thought that resonates, from inner space to exterior space, from fluid through solid states. I will explore the reciprocal relation this resonance holds with our bodies, and with the concept of bodies as natural and built conditions. Firstly, with a brief look at Ora Lucia, which is a thesis I wrote, and then as expanded forms of effect, including the body-mind condition alongside Spinoza, and the interplay of discontinuity and continuity in the erotic with Bataille. As a premise, I'll say, I think that the act of making is the question itself and not the conclusion. What you don't understand dissolves you, at least partially, and places you at the site of change. Okay. So Ora Lucia, Sound as Architecture, was a thesis I wrote for EGS, a school that I go to in Switzerland. It explores the physicality of sound, questioning what is measurable and what is immeasurable, and the relationship between intimacy and monstrosity, the construction of bodies, perception, and effects. It takes an actual event and attempts to understand it through my other, which is logic, in this case through geometry, mathematics, and physics. Ora Lucia begins with an exploration of the geometric art of Islam, tracing the correspondence of dimensional mathematics of antiquity to contemporary geometries and quantum mechanics and their relationship to sound. I wrote this because I had a liminal experience, which was actually a near-death experience, and I went somewhere that was utterly unknown to me. Through it, I felt the interpenetration of fluid and solid states through sound primarily. Ora Lucia is then an exploration into the folds of being, and is paradoxically, with logic, autobiographical. So I'll go over a little bit of that text now, and the text that I'll read to you is actually the introduction, and it's the most intimate part, and the part that I keep going back to. So in a sense, I went through all this landscape of my other, which is this logic, and I keep going back to a sense of intimacy or a sense of frailty, and that perhaps encompasses the talk that I will address today. So this is a preface to my little text. It begins with a question: where is the boundary between something unquestionable and something unanswerable? The ambivalence between the most terrifying and the most magnificent. There are things which can be measured and things which are immeasurable. Intimacy involves monstrosity. I felt myself ejaculated out of my own body, weightless, reabsorbed by unbound space, inhabiting suspensions of perceptual isomorphism. Breath as orbital continuums, chromatic geometries of light. My fingers indenting the cavity between my breasts, my lips inhaling a space with no time. The inexplicable beauty of surrender. It presented itself to itself, the innermost beyond. Fluid traces of matter, ever landing outside themselves. But I could still sense my body in their envelopment, womb-like. What is physicality? Body as trans-site of being. Body as this time. Pressure points of fluidity are here. Yet this here is a threshold, an interval, a beat, something outside itself, by itself, a leak, a fissure, a breath, the truth of difference as such, a violent miracle, love. To listen is to feel is to be sculpted by the impressions of the absolute. And sound is what kept me there, or perhaps what brought me back, an oral cellular process, nullifying, expanding, penetrating me into the unknown. Re-entering time, I encountered a limit, but a collapsible limit, infinitely contained and excluded within itself. All this is that, and any truth is improvised. Do you know the absolute beauty you are made of? Love continues in death, or perhaps begins there, the more quiet you are. I'm gonna have some water. Another excerpt that I'll read from my thesis that I think is relevant to my talk today. It talks about the body in a more intimate way. And it goes, the human body, a harmonious or disharmonious action of fluid sensations and tissues, is a highly sensitive mass, a moving sensor or source subject to fluctuations. What strikes these inner chords are pressure waves, indentations. If we address ourselves in different circumstances and in different states, we notice different intonations in both how we speak, how we listen, how we feel, and how we think. In this sense, sounds act as a form of confession, generating corporeal and emotional shifts. And I'll read the last part where my thesis ends. Sound paints an oral picture of the unobservables that shape us, infinities arising due to quantum effects. Every particle within us is an instrument, a color, an emotion, a possibility, a memory and its remembrance, a polyphonic trace of being, oral sparks within the dark, unbound. So. Now I'd like to move a little bit to Edgar Varese and a little bit of his thoughts. So for the pavilion, Poème électronique. Varese's work was focused on the matter of sound. So again, I'm very interested in the materiality of sound and the relationship that sound has to thought as a material thing. He was focused on sound as a movement of sound masses, as shifting planes, observing their collision and their repulsion. He defined sound as a corporealization of intelligence. The intent for the Philips Pavilion, which was a home for the Poème électronique, was to create a shape that transformed the spectators. So I will continue talking about this theme, how a form or how a body affects another. By creating an unexpected and extreme musical experience that simulated the effect of sound moving through space, he took to heart the dissatisfaction of his age with the music of the past. So there was an otherness, there was obviously a discord that was manifest in his thought. The piece consisted of 7 sequences, and it was 8 minutes long, so this is in itself the structure of an octave. The first part of this being the Genesis. So I'll make a leap of faith now, as Kierkegaard would say, and show you a piece that I think relates to this. So here's a quote by Varese. No matter how original, how different a composer may seem, he has only grafted a little bit of himself onto the old plant, which is history. But this he should be allowed to do without being accused of wanting to kill the plant. He only wants to produce a new flower. It does not matter at first if to some people it looks more like a cactus than a rose. So let me escape this for a second and I'll show you a little piece, an excerpt. Is the sound on or no? Oh crap. Wait. I don't think it's on. That's why it's just yeah? Okay, there you go. whole thing, but I find it very curious that the piece says, I want discipline. So let's go back to our little discussion. So my question to that piece is, what is the relation between discipline and violence? And how does that translate into the body and the act of making? In that sense, Badiou's theory of the event comes to mind, the event being that which disrupts a current situation. In the sense, what I would interpret as a radical otherness. So that radical otherness is that which not meant to please, but that which is meant to be other. This, I believe, parallels Georges and Xenakis, who propose harmony as forms of discord. Often beauty is not enough, and arousal steps in, arousal being the dislocation of perception. In this sense, I would say that arousal is a form of otherness, or the imperfectly known. With this, I'd like to move to what I term the body-mind continuum. My point in this section is to observe how modes of thought and emotion affect the inner body. Body-mind continuum, one thing being the same as the other, and how in turn this shapes through extension our practice as artifice in art, architecture, sound, etc. I will observe some of these properties alongside Spinoza, and particularly his books Ethics. He begins Ethics by drawing a parallel between mathematics and the emotional life. Here I echo the Pythagorean understanding of mathematics, which is mathema, which means reminiscence, to remember, to reassemble, to remake, and also to have one's mind aroused. Eroticism is assenting to life up to the point of death. Bataille's intention is to suggest that for us, discontinuous beings, death means continuity of being. For example, in asexual reproduction, the organism divides into two. The first being has disappeared, it's dead. But at one stage of the reproductive process, there was continuity. Sexual reproduction is independent of death and disappearance, but it also involves a transition from discontinuity to continuity. We are discontinuous beings, individuals who perish in isolation, but we yearn for our continuity. This desire, this nostalgia, is responsible for our forms of eroticism, be it physical, emotional, or work. So, this nostalgia through eroticism is a form of violation. A violation in the sense that it strikes at the innermost core of the living being. This violation is a form of dissonance. Bataille states, the transition from the normal state to the erotic desire implies a partial dissolution. And here I'd like to invoke the etymology of the word dissolution. Dissolution without a solution. So again, the transition from the normal state to the erotic state implies a partial dissolution of the person as he exists in discontinuity, thereby destroying, perhaps momentarily, the self-contained character of the participants. Nakedness then stands in contrast to self-possession. We call this obscene precisely because it disturbs our sense of self-possession. That is, our sense of self as a recognized and stable individual. But eroticism always entails a breaking down of established patterns, the patterns of the regulated social order, basic to our discontinuous modes of existence. In eroticism, our existence is shaken to its foundation. Erotic activity then, by dissolving the separate beings that participate in it, reveals our fundamental continuity, like waves out of a stormy sea. The erotic stands for that instance of eternity, for a continuity in a form of death or dissolution. This form of disequilibrium is a search that carries a spirit towards every potentiality that can open up before it. Or as Badiou says one time to me, 1 + 1 in a room equals infinity. Eroticism calls inner life into play, not merely animal. Here's where we distinguish animal sexuality to the erotic. It is that which within man which calls his being into question. Man emerged from animal states through work and by understanding his own mortality. In this way, his affirmation to life, even in death, is a challenge to death. And death is a path into unknowable and incomprehensible continuity. To this, I remember what I think of each work of art. I think that each work of art, the moment it gets completed, is as good as dead. But within that death, there is continuity. So I'm wrapping it up now. Dissolution is similar to dissonance. Dissonance is akin with evolution. Oops. I'm going to show a little bit more video now, and then I'm going to finish up. But here I'd like to take it back to Spinoza. Eroticism is a modification of the body. And my aim for discussing Bataille in this context was to portray the dissonance and meeting points between discipline and voluptuousness, logos and eros, nature and artifice. If we link this back to mathema as a concept of remembering, a remembrance of the body, we echo Henri Poincaré, who stated, mathematics is not the study of objects, but rather of the relationships between them. In this way, by looking at bodies as erotic mathema, or simply put, poetic mathematics, we see the emergence of a third, that is, a synthesis, or diacritical mark. By diacritical mark, I mean the point of fluidity, the point of convergence, leading to evolution. And this system of three would be composed of the one, the other, and the relationship between them. Or put differently, a point, another point, and the line between them. The line being the foundation of artifice, or the building of a poetic gesture. So in a sense, it all goes back to one line. Okay, you know what? I'm not going to show the other video. I'm going to end right here. So poetry leads us to the same place as all forms of eroticism, to the blending and fusion of separate objects, sounds, or forms. It leads us to eternity, it leads us to death, and through death to continuity. Poetry is eternity, the sun matched with the sea. Thank you. That's it.
I'll show you some work that I did as a subcomponent of an installation that I did here at SCI-Arc last year. I'll try to show it in some of its doubtfully straightforward dimensions. I say that because I'm neither a technician nor an intellectual. I'm more of a hacker that seems to think that the more that we do this, the less we know about words, and I feel like they're just rocks. So I'll just show some pictures, play some sounds, and throw some rocks. Hopefully, some of them will hit you guys somewhere. If I can figure this light setup here. Okay. I made a PDF. There we go. And the name of the presentation is in the spirit of New York No Wave. It's probably the most offensive thing I could think of when Jean-Michel asked me to come up with a name and an abstract for it. So hopefully you'll gain some ground and it'll get some points as it goes, given the synchronicity with the content. All right. One of the recurring themes of the evening seems to be the relationship between sound and matter. I think that there were some examples as to how this relationship was laid out. I'll offer a slight variation on it. And I'll start by reading something that Iranian philosopher Reza Negarestani, who wrote Cyclonopedia, wrote about my installation at SCI-Arc, which after this whole time I'm still trying to parse the terminology out. So again, forgive me. Since Bergson and Gita, it has been philosophically established that the architecture of life as it is organically understood is the inorganic assimilated by the organic so thoroughly that the former becomes incapable of inflecting upon its intensive origins and seeing itself as the resident alien or the insider. That is, abyssal pre-life timescales and spaces remobilized and problematized by pulsating forces, irregular partitions of space, and asymmetrical geometries which shape what is regarded as the organic realm. The piece was called Xenoculture Vivified. And he talks about the management of this relationship between the organic and the inorganic. This will become evident when I show you what it is that we did. But essentially, I will be talking about the relationship between architecture and sound and how to expose its intensive origins by recognizing the alien forces that live within it. So I'll be talking about aliens in one form or another. This is an Ozark big-eared bat, by the way. Craig, you know this project. So anyway, aural bestiality, besides being the most offensive thing I could think of, is my provisional name for the methodology with which the culture of life's hold over the management of the relationship between culture and nature is inverted, and thus allowed to manifest its intensive origins. Again, I think that architecture in general is strained by the coupling of things. It's a very synthetic process, and sound being one of its main synthetic byproducts. We understand usually sound as diegetic to its context, or natural to its context. So the whole pursuit was trying to see what could happen if we start taking these things apart, and then try to use sound as really like a mill or a drill bit, a physical tool for intelligent matter to shape the world. So what we're trying to do is in breaking that relationship up, use sound as a generative tool that in its divergent relationship to architecture hopefully exposes the intensive origins of both. Again, these are simple kind of constraint systems that show the relationship between sound and material in a number of different bindings. I'll talk about this one later, but I'll play some music. I'm not a musician either, I'm tone deaf, and I can't really tell. This is very different from what you will hear
Jovian electron cyclotron emissions.
Astrophysicists tell you what this outer space sounds like. Saturn has lightning apparently deep in its atmosphere, which generates strong radio emissions, similar to the cracks and pops one hears on an AM radio during a thunderstorm. First discovered by Voyager 1, these radio emissions are the only direct evidence of lightning at Saturn so far. This is what Saturn sounds like. It's probably kind of the same thing when you drive to San Diego and you hit Camp Pendleton. They probably have Saturn in a box out there somewhere. But anyway, here it goes. There it is. It's a big planet. So what is the sound of architecture? We operate, again, like I said, under the impression that sound is diegetic to architecture, that it belongs to its context naturally. We design from the pretense of reducing sound to program, optimizing functions. It is secondary to how things work, sound that is, and how things look. But if we believe that there is a binding that links architecture to experience as a source of meaning, sound can be at the very least an intensifier of meaning, and not only experience. At most, it could be a forensic clue to alien culture or xenoculture in one of its dirtiest dimensions. So what if we deconstruct architecture to locate its sonic dimension as something different, something alien to the physical, an architecture intensified by a xenosonic dimension, again, uncoupling the sonic-form relationship. I'll show some of these more things. We can talk a little bit about technique too. I mean, the precedents to the techniques of the installation come from, in this case, I'll just kind of briefly run through two sources. By the way, this image is artist Barry Hall, who uses sonic waves to intensify the material, in this case paint, to show some of the visual structures of sound and its relationship to certain types of emissions. And he uses different types of containers, usually out of Ed Keller's kitchen, in the shape of cookies and all sorts of things to bake with. This one is, I believe, the lobster. The crab didn't give him any results, apparently. He keeps saying that there's a really kind of a strange relationship between the bindings and the sonic envelopes and the exposition of material. But the two things that I was referring to as far as the techniques, links, the first one is Walter Murch. And if you guys are familiar with his work, he's the sound designer behind Francis Ford Coppola, people like George Lucas, defining moments in sound design in cinema, especially around things like The Conversation or Lucas's THX. And he's also obviously an Oscar-winning editor, but he's also kind of credited with the sound designing in film. And one of the things he used to talk about all the time was before we had all the digital tools at our fingertips, he would go out and work with analog recording, and he oftentimes talked about how we use two tape recorders, for example, one to record a sound, the other one to record the recording of a sound in a larger space, and oftentimes he would use the playback at different speeds that the recording was taken, and he would talk about all the time how you could make a room larger by slowing the playback speed down. In other words, there's an intrinsic relationship between time and space through sound that he would use all the time to create, again, this kind of immersive atmosphere. So that's one of the hacks or tools that I think underlies the work that we did with Vivarium. The other one is, again, could be taken back to somebody like John Cage, who I will also play a very brief little thing out of his collaboration with Ledger and Hiller harpsichord, which is a piece of music that deals with the chance superimposition of 7 different types of harp. And again, this is something that were these harp samples were then processed through what at the time was like a Fortran programming language filter in a way to process the inputs algorithmically. The samples that we created for Vivarium, and I'll move to that in a second. And the Vivarium piece is a collaboration between myself and our team, which is another 30 people. Today I'll talk about one person in particular who was the one running the sound engineering team, Jeremy Quinn, who helped us out quite a bit. But it's a collaboration between us and No Wave Anti-Star. how would you call her? Lydia Lunch, who was, in the 80s, one of the seminal figures of New York no-wave scene. She was the central figure in the cinema of transgression movement. Here she is with Rowland S. Howard on the left and Nick Cave on the right. She was one of the first few people to go on spoken word poetry tours after the Beats with people like Henry Rollins, and again, a very kind of driving force in the link between music and performance art. And what we wanted was somebody that would autopsy this beast that we created for the installation. And this is this thing. Some of you might have seen it, some of you might not have seen it. I mean, I'm not going to explain it. But on the right, you see the enclosure. This thing is hosting a series of live organisms like algae, crickets, mung beans, small things, fast biomass stuff, and some software life forms that would then link the pickup sensing systems that these things were wired with to machines that would modify the ecosystem as decoded through the learned behavior between these things. And the system was designed to either go very rapidly towards extinction or very rapidly towards proliferation. Good thing that it went towards extinction, otherwise we probably wouldn't be here and would still be closed by the health department. And that would be in Saturn. So this is a little bit of the media diagram governing this installation. The upper part, the entire upper half is sound. And again, very quickly, what we did is our sound designer, Jeremy Quinn, went out and wired all these species with microphones and pickups to get sound out of the beasts. So this is a little bit of what you get a sense of. There's some media patches, some max patches that were worked to modify and tune these inputs. But essentially, it's a MIDI system governed by temperature. So there's a very direct relationship between the physical live things and the digital translations of these live things. Crickets into. So our crickets, real and virtual. So what we did essentially is we gave Lydia all these samples. She lives in Barcelona, so we shipped everything through yousendit.com. She got a few hundred gigabytes worth of stuff, and this is the stuff that she's used to doing. If you guys, right? Teenage Jesus and the Jerks. In this case, recorded with Sonic Youth Thurston Moore on the bass. So that's another component we're hoping to bring to the mix. It's not loud enough. Okay. And then she recorded this thing, which was again one of her pieces. And then I was like, oh God, it's too wordy. Like I said, terrified of words as rocks. Then I lived with the fact that they were actually rocks. So with a 9-hour difference, everything came to me in the middle of the night. So I would be asleep, awake at night, wondering what was going to fall next, how we're going to get to the next spot, and these things would start showing up, right? And I would listen to them and go, okay. And then one day she sent this, which was the sound base for the actual bacterial opera, made entirely out of Jeremy's recordings from the inside of the monolith. So she created this half an hour monolith in a way that I was pretty excited about. But then the question remained: what's the live performance going to be like? The idea was that at the end we would cut this thing open, like cutting the nose out of like a giant ruin, and either all the beasts were going to come out running and eat us, or they were going to be all dead, and she was going to be cutting it with a chainsaw, and. I thought, what is she going to do, and how is it going to play out, and what is she going to say? And we had gotten so many different versions of the text, and at the end, this is what happened. And some of you guys might have seen this already. I showed it a little few pieces out of Guild a few months ago. But this is the version that we put together for the made-up show at Art Center. So if you want to see the whole length piece, you can go visit it. I'm sure Tim would be very happy. And again, I'm not going to play the whole thing, but I'll just wrap with this sentence, and then we'll skip this until we're done. But the final binding for this was, for me, one of the things that are trickling out there have to do with speculative realism and what those guys have been doing out of England in the past 10 years. People like Reza, out of the Nick Land school, people like Robin McKay. And for me, this was, speculative realism was a way into the creation of this kind of Xeno architecture. In other words, reality is fundamentally unfixed for such thinkers who claim that objects are the products of a more primordial process of becoming, which is connected to historical variations of matter, will, or drive. So, in our work, in this particular piece, is to produce these variations through the inversion of the government of matter over meaning. Again, in this case, defined as strangely sonic or alien sonic.
Incomprehensible matter beyond human understanding.
So if you can tell, it's the, in other words, spoken word piece performed to the bacterial opera, which I was again, it wasn't necessarily what was blotted out, but it's the
looking for the place where
constantly
everything is
nesting of
dissolved,
things.
falls away, is dispersed. Regenerated. I'm spinning out of nothingness.
The words on the wall were a teleprompter, really. They were not part of the set at all, but they seemed to work out quite well in the end. These are some of the video feeds inside the vivarium. Algae, mung beans.
Sight and sound are replaced by an incomprehensible. We inhabit an insignificant planet orbiting a minor star lost in a galaxy tucked away. soaked in blood and brain matter, which makes limbo a little bit more tolerable. Art, music, poetry, all chemical elements, aiming at an incomprehensible eternity, the connective tissue soaked in blood and brain matter that makes limbo a little bit more bearable. Limbo is not fucking bearable. Limbo is not bearable. It's not bearable. Limbo is not bearable. It's not bearable. In this vast dystopia, man, that transitional creature, peeping Tom at the keyhole of eternity. Man, a peeping Tom at the keyhole of eternity, so desperate to decode the mystery of all creation, mapping the space and time between billions of dead stars to the artificial manufacturing of molecular nanotechnology. In this vast dystopia, man, that transitional creature, a peeping Tom at the keyhole of eternity, so desperate to decode the mystery of all creation, mapping the space and time between billions of dead stars to the artificial manufacturing of molecular nanotechnology, still cannot curb his natural tendency to violence. Man cannot curb his natural tendency to violence. It's time to open that now.
And then we opened it and everything was dead. Thank you.
I'm going to talk today about, first, a couple of works of mine, and these are audiovisual works, so I'm interested in the connections between sound and graphics, and maybe hint at more of a conceptual underpinning to these works, which I would say is sonic space-time structures. I guess at this point I'll be clear that I don't want to connect things up too much, but leave it open for interpretation. I'll start with a quote from Xenakis. "There is no pattern in form recognition theory, dependent on harmonic analysis or not, that would enable us to translate curves synthesized by means of trigonometric functions in the perception of forms or configurations. For instance, it is impossible for us to define equivalence classes of very diversified oscilloscope curves, which the ear throws into the same bag. Furthermore, the ear makes no distinction between things that actual acoustic theories differentiate, e.g., phase differences, differential sensitivity ability, and vice versa." And I think this is a very important gem in formalized music, where he's recognizing that maybe some of these connections, audio and visual connections, connecting sound to graphics and vice versa, may not be perceptually intuitive. However, there still may be a connection, and it's maybe important to understand some more about the mathematical underpinnings of where sounds arise from, and also how patterns and shapes can be constructed. So I'll briefly give, a history of some of the early experiments in actually visualizing sound, either from physical apparatus or through electronic means. One of the very first physical experiments in visualizing sound was performed by Thomas Young in 1800, where he wanted to see what kind of patterns and shapes a vibrating string takes. So the way he set up the experiment was just to tie a small reflector to a string. And just by looking at how the light reflected off it was a silver wire he tied onto the string, what kind of shapes would result. And surprisingly, a lot of these shapes have very regular forms And you can see there's a lot of different kinds of symmetries evident in these shapes. And of course, I'm sure there were hundreds more that he didn't illustrate, but he actually did illustrate quite a few. Later on, more experiments were done using different physical apparatus. One of the, probably most people in this room would know something called a Lissajous curve. I prefer to call them Bowditch curves because they were recognized and illustrated much earlier than Lissajous did. The graphs on the left side are traces from a pendulum, just a very simple pendulum in harmonic motion. And what was interesting about these illustrations is that these curves, not only are they very precise, but they form certain polynomial curves. So the top left graph is a parabola, and also you can get variations between lines and circles just by a couple harmonic oscillations. So this was quite a surprise. And of course, Antoine Lissajous came up with a much different apparatus, but came up with almost identical curves using tuning forks and mirrors. In kind of a different vein, Charles Wheatstone invented an apparatus called the kaleidophone, and these curves had a very different characteristic to them than the curves produced by pendulums and strings. They have a much more circular appearance, but the apparatus operated in a very similar way as the strings, Young's strings. He would tie reflectors to these rods and just hit them with a hammer and see the light reflecting off of the, I think he was using metal plates and other things. But he kind of came up with an interesting way to describe these shapes as lines of light. So it was one point in space moving so fast that to our perception it took on a single coherent form. He did note one of the problems with this apparatus was that the forms are very fleeting, so they wouldn't last long. So I guess he had a very good memory, and that's probably why a lot of these illustrations look very perfect and symmetric. Again, in another very different instrument than the previous, are a class of instruments called turning machines, and these date back, I guess, before the Common Era, using lathes to create ornamental patterns. But many of these machines kind of carried on to the mechanical era. The one pictured here is called a geometric chuck. And unfortunately, someone spent quite a large amount of time cataloging some of the patterns that can result from this machine. And I picked out several of them that I found curious in some way. And I would actually say it's practically a scientific term. That word pops up a lot in scientific papers. But what you might notice about some of these figures, especially the one at the top and two to the right of the geometric chuck, it appears like it's 6 linked rings. So that the center portion is where the curve will actually cross between the rings. So if you didn't realize that this was made from one stylus carving out a pattern, it might look like it was, there's 6 different steps in creating this shape. So it combines both, well, the technique of making it is this continuous motion, but the resulting form appears like it's discontinuous. There's multiple shapes. And if you look at some of the other patterns in here, you'll see the same thing occurring. Either the shapes, concentric shapes, or there's just a certain symmetry to them that makes them appear differentiated as well. Much later on, many people were experimenting with oscilloscopes and feeding sound waveforms directly into the X, Y inputs. And what happens here is you'll have two waveforms controlling the cursor on the screen. So a lot of people were experimenting with different waveforms and seeing what kind of shapes result. Herbert Frank was one of the early experimenters in this area, and he wrote about the forms. These configurations are not usually produced as still pictures, but as events. The graphic is a phase picture of such an event. So these images aren't to be seen as a static form, but it's actually a pattern that has been constructed over time. So it's a spatial temporal pattern. Another artist that was did a lot of experiments with these shapes was Ben Lepofsky, and he exhibited thousands of different forms, and his look very organic, I must say. However, they have very precise mathematical definitions underpinning them. Another artist whose work has some very interesting, he made some very interesting observations analyzing his own work. In Trigo, you'll see kind of a spirographic pattern. What's interesting about this pattern is that it conveys a sense of motion. So you can see it as a triangle that's rotating over time, but this rotation has been captured spatially, so you see the temporal progression. What's interesting about this figure is that it can be seen as a traveling wave. So if you've studied physics, you know what a traveling wave is. However, rather than the traveling wave being defined through two separate oscillations, a spatial component and a temporal component, this is a purely temporal traveling wave, which is quite intriguing that can actually happen. So there's only one waveform evolving over time, but it can also give a sense of motion through space. On the right is another one of his works. This again is just one waveform. You wouldn't be able to tell that by looking at it. It looks like it's a bunch of different arcs fragmented. And the way this was produced is very simple, just by mixing very slowly moving curves with very suddenly moving curves. So he's mixing together two different paradigms, the digital and the analog. Analog meaning more curvilinear shapes, and digital meaning more rectilinear shapes, stepped functions. And the steps actually cause the continuous forms to appear split throughout the space. And I think just about any artist who's worked with an oscilloscope will eventually discover the same thing. So I think there's something very intriguing here. I made a piece in 2007 where I wrote a program from scratch, just using a very simple synthesis algorithm, subtractive synthesis, where I could shape the waveform using filters. And the two images on the left are showing one of the first things I observed about this system, that the shape or the spectrum of the sound has a very strong impact on the visual result. So these curves you're looking at are a three-dimensional oscilloscope or Lissajous curve. So what I noticed is if the spectrum only has odd harmonics, you'll get a form that has a twofold cyclic symmetry to it. And if you have all harmonics or even harmonics, the symmetry breaks, so you get an asymmetric form. So you can very precisely control the symmetry of these forms just by controlling the sound spectrum. So I feel there's a very important, really building up a sound through its spectrum is important for the end graphical result. There's these very direct, important connections between the two. So at this time, I'll play just the last half of the piece. A more recent work of mine, I actually started this before S-phase and revisited it recently. This is quite a different algorithm. In Wrapture, I started with a linear iterated map, and this is kind of I guess you could consider it a complete linear system in 4 dimensions. So what I did to kind of give it a little bit more, allow it to do more things, I added a nonlinear component to it, where basically everything gets wrapped into a certain interval. So everything is constrained to a certain degree, and it makes the patterns a little bit more unpredictable. The way the sound is mapped, the algorithm itself generates points in space. So the way I mapped that to sound is I took a histogram of the points in each dimension and mapped that to the spectrum of the sound. So this is kind of an inversion mapping a spatial thing to sound itself. The top right image shows, since this has 4 dimensions in it, I wanted to come up with a way to somehow visualize the 4th dimension. And to do that, I used little glyphs at each point in space. And in the 4th dimension shows more characteristics of the algorithm. In this case, it's displayed as the orientation of the glyphs. So if some of the positional mappings are static, you can still see the 4th dimension evolving, and you'll see that as the glyphs reorient themselves. In addition to just putting glyphs at each point in space, I also wanted to show the sequence itself, the output of the algorithm. And there's something about a sequence, the mathematical concept of a sequence, that I think is important for some of the differences between sound and space. Sound has a very specific order to it. So I wanted to somehow visualize the sequence of the sound. So I'll show some of this work.
I'm wondering how this sort of synthetic construction, which in its certain way is very, it's predictably unpredictable, right? Mm-hmm. And so the impact of, let's say, something like a rite of spring, it comes from a different kind of aspect. Can you try to put those together somehow for me?
Okay. Well, I think narrative is, well, you mentioned narrative. I think that is one of the key points. When you're working with sound, of course, it does have a very strong direction to it, of course, time. That is I guess I don't really have a precise answer for you. I think there's definitely, things we experience. We do encounter patterns and shapes, rhythms in our lives that somehow can be we can strip it down to its essence in some way. I don't expect to find a mathematical equation that gives us the same experiences, but I think it can capture some of the essence. We might remember things through these patterns that we normally would just have an intuition for or feel. So there, as I mentioned, some of these curves, they have very peculiar qualitative aspects to them. I think it's that qualitative part that I'm really curious about. And as far as my research goes, trying in some way just to understand the connection with mathematics. Mathematics has been with us for a long time. And just to kind of connect it to our human experience a little bit, I think is an important step. I hope that answers your question.
Thanks, Lance.
I have to tell a personal experience, which is that when I was 21 years old, I had the opportunity to study briefly with Xenakis at his short course on formalized music at Indiana University. And the next year I went over to Paris and experienced his incredible Polytopes de Cluny. I was so struck by it that I went back 8 times to experience it. And certainly the impact of Xenakis on me and my thinking, certainly as a youth, had an indelible influence. And so it was really wonderful that many years later to return to Paris and to work alongside Xenakis at the CCMix. So I've written a book, which I'm almost done with, finally, which is called Composing Electronic Music, A New Aesthetic. It'll be published by Oxford University Press. It was mentioned earlier that I would talk about microsound. That isn't really what I came to talk about. I did talk about microsound and granular synthesis, atomic decompositions 2 years ago when I was here at SCI-Arc. Today I wanted to speak about the articulation of space, a chapter from my book. But as you can see, it's 33 pages. And we're at the end of a very long night. So I think what we're going to do is just very briefly discuss some of the themes of this chapter, and then play some sounds and show some images. I want to, for the students in particular that may be remaining, I want to point out the some iconic images in the history of sound in space, and in particular the Phillips Pavilion of Xenakis. This is a view inside, looking up at the Phillips Pavilion, and these little objects on the sides of this crazy structure are loudspeakers arranged in clusters designed by Xenakis. Of course, the building was designed by Xenakis. In fact, the building is a translation into space of a composition of Xenakis for a string orchestra. He took the glissandi shapes that are described in the score and mapped them into 3 dimensions, and this structure was created. There were 400 loudspeakers inside the Phillips Pavilion, so spatial distribution of the sound was an integral component of this building. We have a project, we have a space at UCSB called the UCSB AlloSphere, which currently has a 24-channel sound system in it and 4 3D projectors. We are now right in the process this week of ordering, well, we've ordered 32 more Meyer self-powered loudspeakers, and we're just in the process of now ordering another 156 of them. So this would be a 188-channel sound system. Each of the loudspeakers is about $1,000. So this research is funded by the National Science Foundation, and they're going to be installed on the perimeter on the outside of this sphere, which is perforated so that sound can penetrate through it, but you can also project 3D images inside. The idea is to have images that come out from the screen and go through you, and sounds that come out from the screen and go through you as well through the technique of through a technique called wave field synthesis that we've done a lot of experiments with. So I'm going to play some pieces today that are, we only have a 4-channel sound system. These pieces are actually only recorded on 2 channels, but in order to diffuse these or project them in the AlloSphere, we're going to need software assistance. You can't control 188 things with your hands. So we need to create spatialization software that effectively upmixes a piece in a low number of channels into 188 channels. So we have a PhD student working on this software right now that I'm going to be working with in the future. So these pieces that I'm going to play are 2 channels distributed to 4, but I hope you can come up to the AlloSphere and hear them in 188 channels. This is a piece that I made in 2009. It's called Touche Pas. It explores very extreme sound phenomena, individual sample points that are very like clicks, patterns of tiny clicks, very high frequency, but also deep bass frequencies as well. Lasts about 3 minutes. Well, that's what happens when you have 2 cups of coffee to stay awake. You get a little jittery. The next, I'm going to conclude by playing some excerpts from the works that I made with the video artist Brian O'Reilly. Brian works with film and video. These are not synthetic images. These are all images created with cameras and directly painting on film. It's called Point Line Cloud. Okay, thanks very much.
Well, whoever is still here, this is hardcore audience. You're going to be sleeping well and dreaming, that's for sure.
Since I'm going to be a real bore, this brings me back this whole evening to the experiments that John Whitney and people like that were up to, Stan Brakhage, burning the film and so forth and so on. And I'm thinking, okay, there are 40, maybe 50 years of work in this arena.
Norman McLaren scratching.
Norman McLaren, yeah, okay. So there are about 50 years of development. So I presume we could imagine that this is a classical form.
I guess you could.
And I'm presuming that there are, just as we have in architecture, now we're getting into parametric design and so forth. And so I'm presuming that there are certain constraints under which you guys are operating. I'm not a musician, so I don't really know. But I'm seeing what I read as constraints, and I'm wondering why relatively accessible emotional strings call them cliches, are absent. I think of Gesang-Jungenlieder, which almost makes you sob, even though it's spliced up audio tape.
It's made with children's
It
voices.
has
so
some
you have
children's
that.
voices.
Yeah.
Yes. I understand. Okay, but why is that? Why is that? I mean, it's marvelous work. It's incredibly beautiful and engaging, but it doesn't make me either fill with pride or sob. I want it to make me sob.
We can find things that could do that.
Could
for
you?
I think.
That's right.
I think so, yes.
I mean,
We're talking about eroticism.
yeah, I mean, to me it
anything
is.
sexy yet.
To me, it is about that. I mean, it's about, or at least my process was, even when I was writing this thesis that I wrote, it was so much about logic, and then I was thinking, well, where's the emotion in that? You know, like where's that stuff that makes you sob, or that invokes a center that is not maybe fully understandable, but
you're in the realm of artistic decision making where I mean, there are plenty of artists in this realm and others that would actually assert that there's no place for emotion in it.
I know that.
Right. And that and by keeping it out, if that's possible, I'm not sure it's actually possible to keep it out completely, that you leave it open for the greatest range of interpretations, for people to layer in their own. So it's sort of like Xenakis talks about the line between determinism, which he also called in one of the videos I didn't show, faithful reproduction, and indeterminacy or stochastics as unfaithful reproduction. You could layer, some qualitative things on that. Well, maybe there's also a kind of line or oscillation back between the attitudes of attempting to keep, to rid a piece of all individual attention or kitsch or whatever, and the other extreme of that being the origin of the impulse. See what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm afraid I bemoan that among my architectural colleagues. So I'm not entirely without, a kind of class envy here.
Yeah. Well, then we make our choices. We choose what we want to take off the shelf and take home.
Well, people are speaking about going home. We are up for the night shift. I know some people are leaving, some people will be coming. The second stage of the evening is to health and beauty that is going to keep SCI-Arc alive through the night. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you to the panel. Thank you to presenters. Thank you to the audience for a really terrifically inspiring evening. Thank you to all.